Hi, this is Farid Wiley. I made a video on how to think about the security in crypto hardware wallets. Crypto hardware wallets are high security devices for saving your coins. I happen to have a Ledger, and recently Ledger messed up. And I went out looking for other devices. Very few of the videos I saw describe the kind of security model for each device in a manner that I would have preferred it described. So this video kind of talks about how I think about security when I'm thinking about these hardware wallets. Um, One thing I want to point out is that security is a chain of trust. There are many entities, you're trusting them, and what you do is you look at each of those trust points and decide whether it's acceptable or not, what the risk is at each point. And together they form a level of trust in the hardware device that you're using. This chain starts with the seller, who has to give you secure hardware. If the seller is giving you firmware updates, he has to give you secure firmware upgrades. Normally, the device, the wallet, is pretty simple. So they attach it, they don't want to attach it to the internet, so they attach it to a processor of some kind, a laptop or a phone. And that gives the user a rich experience, and the user gets to choose what he wants to do, who he wants to send to, and how much. This really can't be trusted because there are too many apps running on it. It's connected to the internet, it could be hacked. But what you do is you verify. The hardware device has the keys or access to the keys, and the hardware device has to be trusted to validate the transaction with the user. So this transaction came from the processor, but it must be shown to the user so the user can validate that this is right. What I want to do is, and the device has to be trusted to do a valid signature on the transaction. The device itself has access to the key, and the key needs to be in a key locker, either encrypted internally or some sort of external device. That locker has to be trusted to sign correctly and to never leak the key material. I should put down there the sign correctly, but yes, never leak the key material. That kind of analysis can be applied to the devices, and let me pick a few that I will do. Ledger is one of them, since it's the one I have, and they messed up. Let me start from the left. Ledger chooses a wallet, a hardware wallet, with a chip in it called a secure element. This chip, it's very hard to open it to find what's inside, and the key is protected inside that chip. So there's a secure element. It can sign transactions, so it never has to reveal the key to anybody. It's just if a transaction wants to be signed, it is passed to the secure element. The secure element signs it and passes it back. Um, that failed in the case of Ledger. It failed through a self-inflicted wound. I don't know why they allow the key to leak from that secure element, but they offered a feature, an upgrade, a method of backing up the key that made it clear to everybody that the key was leaking out of that secure element. So in a sense, that's a fail. The wallet itself is a dedicated hardware wallet with a user interface, which is good. That means the user can be shown the transaction that's being passed from the laptop before the wallet signs it. And only if the user accepts that transaction does the wallet sign it. The problem is that wallet runs firmware, and that firmware is trusted to make correct use of the secure element, which in this case we're not sure what's happening that allows the key to be leaked. But in the case of Ledger, it was. Normally, that secure element will not let the key leak, no matter what firmware is running in the ledger in the wallet. But anyway, it's also being trusted to display to the user a valid transaction that the user wants, and that's the transaction that is signed by this firmware. Um, Without that display, of course, the wallet could have signed anything, a transaction, a malicious transaction that sends the funds to a destination, a malicious destination. Anyway, the laptop the ledger is connected to a laptop, and that's the main user interface. So there's client software running there, and the client software gives the user a rich experience. He can choose who he wants to send to, from what coins, how much he wants to send. And again, the laptop is not trusted, but it doesn't need to be. Essentially, it's checked. The transaction the user selects is passed to the ledger, which then displays it back to the user for verification. There's also another function that happens between the company and the wallet, which is passing of firmware updates. And again, the laptop doesn't have to be trusted because using secrets at both ends, Ledger and the wallet can create a tunnel, encrypted tunnel, that passes the firmware correctly back to the wallet. At Ledger, again, we're trusting the manufacturing. It's a one-time trust. But we have to trust the firmware release again and again and again for the life of the product. In other words, they choose to fix bugs, they choose to add functionality, and they do it through pushing firmware to the Ledger wallet. Now, whether they make a mistake, for example, adding a functionality that the user doesn't feel is warranted, or whether they're hacked and a malicious piece of firmware happens to be released and make it into the Ledger wallet, that is a vulnerability. Because with that firmware, as we see at the Ledger wallet, we could display an incorrect validation to the user, make him think he's sending the money to the right place, when the firmware, this malicious firmware, is really going to be signing a transaction that is malicious. So there's this purple problem here. Other than the fact that the secure element failed, that's a self fail. That should not have failed in the way that they made it fail. I don't know why that key was exposed there. The Trezor is another one I considered. It has a security model that's very similar to Ledger. Starting at the right, we have Trezor is actually trusted to manufacture correctly, and it's trusted to create firmware that's valid. Unfortunately, that firmware is being created again and again and again. So for the life of the product, Trezor has to be secure and against hacking, against management decisions to include elements that we don't want them to include. So I marked it vulnerable, as I did in the previous case. Laptop is the same. A rich interface to the user, creation of transaction, but the transactions are verified in the Trezor wallet, which has a screen which allows the user to verify the transaction before Trezor wallet signs it. Um, Trezor wallet does not have a secure element to protect the key. What happens is the wallet protects the key through encryption using a PIN that the user enters. In that way, the key is protected. But that is a major weakness, I think, because if you lose your wallet or if someone steals it and they open it, they can extract an encrypted key. Now, it's encrypted, but it's protected by a PIN, a human memorable, human selected PIN that a high-speed decryptor can quickly run through all the possibilities and end up decrypting the key, and they end up with the key. So that kind of protection against opening the Trezor and extracting an encrypted key and then decrypting it by searching for the PIN is this major weakness we want to avoid. So we really, that's why I marked that as vulnerable. As usual, we have to trust the firmware. The key, if it's encrypted, is going to be decrypted before a transaction is signed, which means the key is going to be in the clear to the main Trezor wallet firmware, and that key can be copied. And we trust the firmware not to intercept and make a copy of the key. We also trust the firmware to display the validation information correctly to the user. And again, that's tied back to the whole firmware process at Trezor, which is going to be the source of any errors in this firmware. So pretty similar, but the keys is protected through encryption on the wallet rather than through an element that a chip that is designed to protect the key. In other words, it's harder to extract an encrypted key from a chip that is designed to resist that. The next device I want to look at is the Jade security model. Jade is another hardware wallet, and I considered it and I looked at it, and it's very similar again in the chain. Jade as a company, I forgot the name of the parent company, but it manufactures the device. You have to trust that. And it creates firmware, which you have to trust. And again, it allows for updates, which means the firmware release process has to be correct again and again and again throughout the life of the product. And I've marked it vulnerable. The software, in this case, let's say it's running on a phone, gives the user a rich interface. He can create transactions using that, but the transactions, again, are validated in the wallet through a user interface. The user can see that that's the right transaction, and he trusts that to the firmware running in the wallet, and the firmware has access to the encrypted key and will sign the right transaction if the firmware is correct and broadcast that. Again, you're trusting that firmware to be presenting to you the right transaction and not signing a malicious transaction that drains your funds. The difference here is that Jade encrypts the key, but not only with the PIN, which can be searched because it's a human memorable PIN. It encrypts it with 2 factors or more, 2 or 3 factors. The PIN and a secure secret that lives in a server external to the wallet. So the wallet actually tunnels through the phone to get to that server on the internet, but those tunnels can be made secure. The server is blinded as to who's making the request, but it's able to serve up this high security key, which is a second factor that allows the Jade wallet to decrypt the key for the signing process. What's interesting, what is relevant here is that server will only respond a handful of times, maybe 3 times or 5 times. If it fails to be verified, it will it will erase the information. It will delete the fragment. So it's a second factor that is able to delete the second factor after n tries, which makes the encrypted key very difficult to decrypt because you can't run a high-speed decryptor on it. For each decryption, you have to hit the server with a request. And in this protocol, you have to. And so after 3 or 4 requests that fail, that fragment is gone, and now you're faced with a very hard encryption key that you can't really search. But in the wallet, that key is decrypted if the valid PIN and the valid interaction with the server happens, and it's necessary for it to be decrypted so that the wallet itself can sign a transaction. So you're trusting the firmware not to make a copy of the key when it's decrypted. The key is decrypted for a short interval while the transaction is signed. You're also, as usual, trusting the firmware to correctly display to the user what transaction is being signed. And so that all traces back to the validity of the firmware coming from the company. And again, that's vulnerable, I think, because it's an ongoing trust that has to be for the life of the product. Very similar to the previous one. The key is better protected with the two-factor, but it's got the same problem of the firmware that needs to be trusted. Finally, I wanted to look at Tangem. It was interesting to me because they protect the key quite well on a key card. This is a credit card sized device with an active part that contains the key and I sure hope does the actual signing of a transaction, or part of it at least. I'm not sure how that works, but if it doesn't do the signing itself, then the signing is done in the phone, which is not acceptable. The phone is pretty insecure. So let's assume the card doesn't leak. Let's assume the card does the actual signing. So now if we look at the phone, that's a terrible environment. It's of course a beautiful interface to the user, but if you use it for validation, then you've run into a vulnerability. The app the wallet is an app that runs on the phone, but we know phones are vulnerable. We know that we have no idea which app is actually running because you could run an app that looks like the correct wallet, but it's just masquerading. Getting the user PIN and creating a malicious transaction and having the hardware card sign it. So you're trusting that there's no malware on the phone and that it's correctly interfacing to the card and it's correctly displaying to the user. Of course, that firmware could come from the app if it's being run correctly. That firmware, you're still relying on Tangem to correctly create and release it, and they could make the decision to introduce a feature that you don't like. But more importantly is you're not even sure you're running the right app on a phone. Otherwise, I mean, creating tunnels between the wallet and Tangem for firmware updates is probably something you can trust. It's an old technology. So anyway, I marked the display of the validation to the user as vulnerable because you have no idea whether your phone's carrying malware. So in general, Ledger has a problem because it apparently allows backdoors for key extraction. It allows for misinformation to the users to where the funds are going, what transaction is being signed, because essentially malicious firmware could be injected during a wallet upgrade. You have to trust the process at Ledger to work again and again for a long time. Trezor has the same problem. It encrypts the key, but it only encrypts it with a PIN. So if you lose your Trezor, they can decrypt the key through a brute force search for the PIN. It's a human memorable PIN, so that's possible. And it's got the same problem that if the firmware is malicious, the user has no idea what he's signing because he sees what the firmware wants him to see while in the background a different transaction is being signed. Jade has a better protection of the key by using two-factor with a server that'll kill the second factor if you attempt to decrypt the key more than a handful of times. So that is good, but it still has the problem that malicious transactions that are created by a malicious application in the phone can be signed because the phone is misinforming the user as to what transaction is being signed. Tangem doesn't even try to inform the user as far as I know. The app that's running on the phone could be assigning funds to anywhere. And that app is in a phone that is potentially carrying malware. And again, there's a weakness because firmware at the firm that is faulty could make it into the app during an app upgrade, which is bad. So, I mean, there's all these bad things. What you have to do is kind of decide which one you're willing to live with. What would I wish for? I would wish for not having firmware upgrades at all. I mean, if I buy a hardware wallet, I want it to be good, and I want to test it, and I want it to remain good. I don't want new firmware in this thing coming from the company, because you really need to stay up to date, etc., to keep your coins usable. With no firmware downloads, there's no possibility of corruption from that side. Essentially, what they have to do is produce firmware that's small enough that they can get the bugs out of it, or whatever's left can be worked around for the life of the device. You can't add functionality to that device. I suggest that the company could add new devices instead. If you want to manage different tokens, you would have a different device, and that device has firmware that doesn't change. If you want to add backup for the key, you add a new mechanism or a new device to do that. If you have to do firmware updates, then at least make it open source and allow for extended periods while that source is inspected by third parties. So that source could be signed and then dated, and then the wallet would not accept it for, say, 120 days or something like that. Some period where there's some hope that the examiners can prevent malicious code from making it into the wallet. I think this is second best, because I'm not sure how many people would look at the code, but given enough time, a problem hopefully will be found. I think you must have user verification screens with the wallet. Those wallets that don't do that correctly are just asking for trouble, because with a malicious app, they could be signing any transaction, including malicious ones that drain your wallet. If you and even with a verification screen, you can't trust what's being displayed if you can't trust the firmware. So that all comes back to what the firmware problems are. I do prefer a security chip or some external two-factor or a card if you can combine it with the other factors that I want, because if I lose my wallet, I don't want it to be hackable. I don't want them to be able to open it, extract an encrypted key, and then work on decrypting it. The Tangent card is nice, but they need to do something about user verification, which is happening on the phone right now, which is, I don't think, is acceptable to me, at least for big amounts of money. Again, what I'm telling you is it's all compromises so far. I don't find the list I have here in any one device. So choosing a device is a compromise. It's probably still better for me, at least the amounts that I have, than a paper wallet. But yeah, there are places where you have to trust things that I'm not sure I do want to trust. Thank you, and have fun choosing a wallet.